My name is Rich Makadok, and I'm the organizer of this professional development workshop called Corporate Strategy Issues in Platform-Based Business Models. And I want to start off just by saying thank you with great gratitude to the members of the STR Division team who helped to make this session possible, starting with Michael Leiblein, who accepted the proposal, Samina and Aseem, and Zhao, who scheduled it and helped us get organized, Paolo, who helped promote it, and Bill, who is our host of the meeting today and running the technical side of things, and also helped to manage the registration list of participants, which he told me before the meeting has swelled to 225 registered participants. So we're greatly honored to have such a strong response to this workshop. Bill wants to do a group photo for the purposes of public relations for the division. So may I encourage everybody to just briefly turn on your cameras so that we can do the group photo, just for a moment at least, unless you're not prepared to be viewed. But gently.
I stop you for sharing your screen so I see all the people.
Oh, okay. So I should stop
just
sharing
for a second. Yeah. So I see as many people as
share.
possible.
Okay.
Yeah,
good.
that's great. So I can. Yeah, this is 49 people max, so you can just say hi.
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 I'll see if this works quickly. I think it worked. Yep, I have a picture.
Got your picture?
I got my picture. Thanks.
Very good. Well, thank you, Bill. So let me go back to sharing my screen. Can you guys all see that slide? Just give me a nod if it looks, you can see it. Yeah, it looks like people are nodding. Good. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give just a few opening remarks. I'll try to be as brief as possible. In fact, I'm going to set myself on a timer here. And then after that, we'll have our three keynote speakers, Anpu Mahalingam, Brian Wu, and Feng Zhu, who will each present papers on the general topic of corporate strategy issues and platform-based business models. We will then have about 10 minutes to do question and answer for the keynote speakers. And for that Q&A period, I'm going to encourage everybody to please share your questions via the chat window. So please open the chat window if you want to ask a question and put your question in there. I will moderate the Q&A session by getting the questions out of the chat window. Then we'll take a 5-minute break for any biological necessities. And then we will have our panel of 5 distinguished panelists, David Collis, Claudine Gartenberg, Aseem Kaul, Todd Zenger, and Ron Adner, who will be speaking on to various aspects of corporate strategy issues in platform-based business models. Then again, at that point, we will have another 10 minutes for Q&A for the panelists. And again, I'll moderate that, and please put your questions in the chat window. We'll take another brief break for biological necessities. And then we had a number of people who registered their research ideas via email. And for those participants who registered their ideas via email, we will break out into roundtable discussions in, I think, 5 breakout rooms to exchange ideas on research projects on this topic and see if we can help improve those ideas. Okay, so I did want to make a few remarks about what this session is about, what this workshop is about. So corporate strategy issues and platform-based business models, what the heck does that mean? Good question. So let me turn to the general question of what is corporate strategy, right? When we talk about corporate strategy issues, what are we talking about? Corporate strategy, of course, as you all know, is research on the question of how do managers set and oversee the scope of their firms. You know, Rumelt, Schendel, and Thies in their fundamental questions paper talked a bit about this, and Emily Feldman did a very nice recent literature review on corporate strategy, which sets out basically three areas that corporate strategy encompasses. The first being, how is it that managers decide which businesses belong within the boundaries of their firms and which ones do not? And so we see in this stream of corporate strategy research, we see studies of diversification, vertical integration, mergers, acquisitions, et cetera. Corporate strategy also encompasses the question of how do managers coordinate resources within the boundaries of their firm. And so here we're looking at studies, research on synergies, resource sharing, resource redeployment, capital budgeting, internal capital markets, and the like. And then another piece of corporate strategy research is on the question of how do managers coordinate relationships with other firms across firm boundaries. And so here we're looking at many studies that have been done on alliances, joint ventures, and other forms of partnerships. So how does all this apply to platform-based business models? Well, let me take a look at each of these in turn. I think on all three of these dimensions, platform business models play a role. So for example, many people may not realize this, but when the iPhone was launched, it did not originally have an app store. And the app store was added about 2 years later. So what Apple did in launching that app store is they, in some sense, outsourced their diversification decisions to the world. Each of those 2 million apps that are in the Apple App Store have the potential to change the iPhone into a different product than it was originally intended to be. And so each of the app developers is, in a sense, making a diversification decision on behalf of Apple. So that's one aspect of this for platforms. Another, of course, is that platforms build resources and capabilities within their boundaries. And a third is that platforms, of course, also have to maintain horizontal and vertical relationships with other platforms, with outside complementors, and with non-platform firms. Okay. So the general purpose of this workshop is to get a start on building a research agenda for applying corporate strategy research in platform-based business models. And why is that? Because technology-focused research does not tell the whole story. So the question here we're going to be addressing is, how do we leverage over 40 years of research on corporate strategy to help us understand platform-based business models? How do we make platform research a subfield of corporate strategy? That may be a little bit of a provocative question. Some may not want it to be a subfield of corporate strategy, but I think we can learn a little bit from the experience of how research on alliances, joint ventures, and other forms of partnerships became a subfield of corporate strategy. In effect, those researchers broadened the definition of corporate strategy to include coordination of resources across firm boundaries, not just within firm boundaries. And so we're going to ask the question here is some analogous reframing of corporate strategy needed now with regard to platform-based businesses? Okay, I think that's all I have to say. And so I'm going to relinquish the floor to Anpu to present the first paper. And we did get started a few minutes late, so we're probably going to run a few minutes late on the other side. My apologies for that.
All right, hope you can hear me. All right, thank you very much for inviting me to present in this PDW. I'm going to focus today on how the value creation and the capture process emerge from synergies in the platform-based business models. And we use an information theoretic perspective to explain this. And this is a joint work with Professor Rich Makadok. As you know, diverse set of notions are put forward on what the platform-based business models are and how the underlying value proposition potentially works. More economics-oriented scholars have discussed the importance of two-sided network effects and how they can be the source of value creation. Technology-oriented scholarship has focused on some of the salient features in the platform market, such as extendable code base, matching algorithms, removing bottlenecks, and wide variety of other tools. An important ecosystem perspective focuses on how the platform owners orchestrate the participation of complementers in the ecosystem and how that can lead to creation of value. Here, getting the alignment structure right for the multilateral set of partners is emphasized to be critical for a focal value proposition to materialize. While all these perspectives have helped us to understand the phenomenon better and advance the discourse about the platforms, more classical and core strategy-oriented scholars have recently started to notice that these explanations are insufficiently fundamental to capture the elemental core of the phenomenon and limits the contribution strategy scholars can distinctively make to this discussion. So responding to this call, in this paper, we take a step at this issue through a classical corporate strategy perspective. We ask some fundamental questions. What economic problems do these platforms solve? What functions do they actually fulfill for the users? More importantly, are there any synergies among these functions? If these synergies do really exist, how do these synergies affect the scope of the platform, that is the breadth of the functions they fulfill? So if I may paraphrase Forrest Gump's "Stupid is as stupid does," platform is, as platform does. A hint emerges from the fact that platform-based business models, as others have noted, predate modern information technological revolution altogether for a long time. There are some famous examples: medieval fairs in France, Turkish and Persian bazaars, trade posts in Asia's old Silk Route postings. Yet all these historic platforms never grew to dominate the world economy in the same way that we see today. So the technology supported by this mobile and telecommunication revolution merely allows the platforms to scale up the functions they have always performed, but not to create them altogether in a de novo fashion. So in that spirit, in this paper, we abstract away from the technological details, network effects, and other stylistic aspects and focus on the economic problems and market frictions these platforms solve and the functions they fulfill for the users. There are three classical information economics problems. They come from coordination costs, search costs, and transaction costs. A platform may or may not serve an interfacing function solving coordination problems, but when they do, they solve by providing standardized channels, formal, informal, and tacit mechanisms without which these parties could not interact or interface with each other. Platform also may or may not serve a matching function helping parties to find each other. But when they do the matching function, solving search problems, they do through several tools, including categorization, database query, recommendation mechanisms, and many others, without which these parties could not discover each other. Platform also perhaps may or may not serve a de-hazarding function. But when they do, they solve adverse selection and moral hazard problems. They use wide variety of mechanisms, including escrow, bonding, monitoring, testing, review, without which these parties could not trust each other to do a transaction. So to summarize, interfacing or coordination function helps to identify when and where do these parties meet to create value. For example, what language or protocols do they use to communicate with each other? Matching function helps to understand which specific parties will create value together. And transaction function identifies how do these parties mitigate opportunistic value capture that might otherwise preclude the value creation to begin with. I want to provide some examples on how these platforms differ according to which of these information functions they seek to lubricate. Sometimes these examples can take you into alternative pathways, but I think they are still helpful for us to understand the phenomena. For example, some platforms just lubricate one type of friction. Consider Craigslist, for instance. it only tries to solve the search problem by matching buyers and sellers with each other, but makes no attempt to coordinate when and where the sellers and buyers should meet with each other, offers no method for mitigating transactional hazards. On the other hand, there are other platforms lubricate two, even all three frictions. Think about Amazon's Kindle ebook platform. On the coordination side, Kindle defines standard file formats and communication protocols by which the publisher's content interacts with reader's device. Search problems here are alleviated by Kindle's recommendation engine, and transaction problems are solved by Amazon's payment and Kindle's digital rights management system. So, why do these platforms differ on which friction or the combination of frictions they lubricate? This is a classical corporate strategy question on firm boundaries and scope. Corporate level strategy focuses on what kind of combinations of markets or businesses a firm engages in. How do they possibly relate with each other and understand the reasons behind them doing so? We ask the same question about these information functions rather than about the markets or businesses. Corporate level strategy also focuses on synergies between these businesses. So we do the same. Are there any synergies between these functions? As a first step to answer this question, we develop a game theoretical model to explore the synergies. I want to put some boundary conditions on this paper. Obviously, we cannot address every possible synergy in one of the first papers on this topic. So to keep it manageable, we only focus on the demand side synergies. We also consider the limits on these synergies that come from data and privacy concerns. Supply side synergies often come from cost reducing economies of scope, whereas demand side synergies come from reduced shopping cost for the buyer, greater customer willingness to pay that come from better integration across products, improved customer productivity, or customer knowledge that spans in range of product categories. So in our model, we calculate platforms' added value through taking the difference between the total value for the both sides with the platform and the total value for both sides without the platform. In our model, platform captures a fixed portion of the added value as its profit. We define platform's demand side synergy as improving platform's one of the information functions, increasing potentially the profitability of improving another one of the information functions. Let me now show some formal model assumptions. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip the math, but I'm happy to talk offline if you have any questions about this. In the coordination model, we take sets of principal and sets of agents. These two sets are conflicting preferences on when and where they want to meet and how do they want to meet and communicate. Each set is too large and too diffuse to act as a group, and resolving their conflicting preferences with each other in a contractual fashion is hard or nearly impossible. Each side can accommodate the other at a cost or not to accommodate at all. However, the value is created only when either one of the sides or both sides accommodate the other. Platform here reduces the risk of neither side accommodating with each other, which could lead to zero payoffs, by sending signals in an AOM correlated equilibrium. Platform reduces this risk by the factor of delta. Once the principals and agents have coordinated enough to meet, each principal can only create value after matching with a specific agent or vice versa. In our model, we assume the principal and agent has a baseline probability of successfully matching with each other without the platform. However, the platform improves this matching probability by a factor of tau. Principal and agent without a successful match cannot create any value, leading to zero payoff for both. Finally, the principal and agent pair now can create value together, with each possibly capturing some part of the value. Here, the agent privately sets unobservable level of effort with quadratic cost, capturing the diminishing returns for the increasing effort. Total value created here is a sum of agent's effort and a random noise shock. However, the principal only observes the total value created, not the agent's effort. The principal obviously wants to motivate the effort of the agent, So the principal sets the wage of the agent as a function of the value created by the agent. Principal captures the residual here, meaning the total value created minus the agent's wage by the principal. And platform reduces this noisiness of the random shock by a factor of lambda here. We solve this model through an equilibrium derived through backward induction. And to find the platform's added value, we first derive the baseline disintermediated version of the model without the platform. Then we have the platform and calculate for the platform intermediated version of the model, both with and without the privacy concern. Here, to de-hazard the transaction, meaning to reduce the noisiness of the random shock, platform must collect intrusive information about the agent. This intrusion by the platform reduces agent's utility by a factor of phi for each unit of noise reduction performed by the platform. Thank you. This reduction of utility from privacy concerns for agent may come from multiple sources: discomfort, compliance cost, inconvenience, platform selling the data to advertisers, risk by data breach by the hackers, and many others. Next, we move on to do the comparative statistics to calculate the synergies between all three pairs of these platform capabilities, namely coordination, matching, and transaction. Then we go on to calculate the limits or reversal of synergies that come from the privacy concerns phi in our extended model. I want to show you 4 key results in this paper. First, without the privacy concerns, if the platform has the capability for each of these functions, all these synergies are almost always positive and they are never negative. However, all these synergies that we see turn negative, meaning they become counter-synergistic for sufficiently high levels of privacy concerns. However, the threshold to turn negative may differ across different pairs of synergies across these capabilities. We also find the threshold for negative synergy between the coordination and the matching capabilities may be the higher or lower than the corresponding threshold of the other 2 synergies, depending upon the severity or intensity of agents' privacy concerns and the strength of platform's de-hazarding capability. So this threshold difference might motivate platform to perform one function, but not the other 2, or vice versa. Or if the privacy concerns are sufficiently below both the thresholds, platform might perform all 3 functions. Therefore, the demand-side synergies we see may influence a platform's location in the Venn diagram that I showed you earlier. To conclude, what are the key takeaways here? First, in this paper, we focus on synergies among platforms' informational functions, rather than information technology per se. In doing so, we provide a first step towards understanding platform design as arising from the extension of classical corporate strategy logic by deriving it from demand-side synergies and the limits on it. Second, Professor Dan Schendal, the founder of Strategic Management Society and Strategic Management Journal, SMJ, has once told me in early stages of my PhD that corporate strategy is the high church of strategic management field, because that's where the most critical distinction of our field for both research and the practice come from. Because we ask the question, how can managers make a difference at a corporate level? So in that spirit, we want to initiate a conversation with platform researchers about carefully examining what are the corporate strategy aspects of platform-based business models that are quite consistent with what we know about the other businesses. What are the corporate strategy aspects of platform-based business models that are slightly different from what we know or very different from what we know about the other businesses? And more importantly, as strategy researchers, what can we do about it? So we receive, retain, and replenish the wisdom from the expansive corporate literature, yet expand it to the newly emerging phenomenon on platform-based business models. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anpu. Okay, next up is Brian Wu. Brian, take it away.
Van, you're on mute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Aseem. Thanks, Rich. Many thanks to Anpu for organizing this wonderful event and inviting me. And I also really appreciate all the academic colleagues whose efforts made this happen. So I'm a corporate strategy scholar, and I'm by no means platform expert. So I'm quite surprised or honored, by Rich's invitation. I guess to me, I just still try to figure this out. I think my value here would be to serve as a case study, to illustrate the theme of this PDW, meaning that let's say my primary research is as Rich introduced in the beginning, right? So really about corporate scope and industry evolution, right? So specifically, I study how competitive advantage is created and destroyed.
Brian, could you show us your slides in full screen?
Oh, okay, yeah, I almost figured this out. Is this better?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not very technology savvy. Sorry about that. So mainly I take a capability-based perspective, like a David Collis here, So I also use formal modeling. So whenever I start a research project, I like to use a very simple mathematical model to think through issues, and then try my best to find some sort of experimental settings, or use very detailed data like census or some kind of a Department of Defense contrast, very fine-grained data set. So that's kind of my research approach. So the reason I'm saying that I serve as a case study for this PDW is that my existing research, I would say more or less kind of examines linear value chains, right? So the traditional kind of industries in some way, right? Or at least the focus wasn't on like the non-linear aspects, right? The increasing returns or two-sided effect platforms, etc. Right? But more recently, I started doing research on global value chain climbing, both let's say after China's entry into WTO and post-COVID, right? So I'm kind of collecting data on the automotive industry, right? So how the global supply chain and network, in fact, will change. So I'm collecting real-time data with a doctoral student. I mean, you can imagine, right? So how the global supply chain will change, but also I work with engineering colleagues on electric vehicle charging system. It's just the fun, it's working with engineering colleagues. I mean, the best part is that they publish papers much faster. So that's like 1,000 times better than strategy or measurement. Also more recently, I been working with some other colleagues like Deepak or Nandini, Laurie, Alex, on some platforms, but really I would say that I'm a newcomer. I'm a learner, beginner in the platform and the ecosystem literature. It's just fun. So again, I almost want to end my presentation with this slide because I think that to me, I really appreciate Rich organizing this PDW, right? Because I mean, that's precisely the kind of curiosity I have, right? So for example, again, as I said, right? So my dissertation studied diversification discount, right? So the very traditional corporate strategy question, right? But nowadays, as you guys pointed out, right? So let's say when it's come to Amazon or Google, how do you define diversification in the first place, right? So that, to me, that's a curiosity. And therefore, I spent my sabbatical in China, serving as a strategic advisor for DD. So it's just a fascinating experience. It's a wonderful year, although it's very bad for health because the air was pretty polluted. And I gained many pounds eating Chinese food. But still, so I learned so much, right? When I talk about the corporate strategy, right, in the kind of a platform or ecosystem-based model like a Feng or Adner, what they studied recently, right? It just, like how do we think about the boundary of an ecosystem, right? So how do we map this to the traditional or classic corporate strategy question like a diversification, like the mode, right? For example, I was involved in one big decision, like whether to use alliance or acquisition to enter, let's say, aftermarket services or used car services, right? So should this just imagine, right, for those who live in US, just imagine Uber, right? So entering Uber Eats, right, food delivery post-COVID, right? So just think about it. Should Uber just direct the user flows to let's say DoorDash, or just simply acquire, right? I mean, recently you saw the dynamics, right? So between Uber Eats or DoorDash or Postmates, all the acquisitions, alliances, that sort of things. So the second experience was also I've been serving as academic advisor for Alibaba Research Institute. Again, it's a wonderful experience. Very similar kind of a dynamics, right? So the evolutionary process of their business portfolio, right? So I would say that to answer Rich earlier comment, I think I think the essence probably still applies. The essence of the logics, right, strategy, economics still applied in terms of market frictions, the firm boundaries. But definitely we should also incorporate more, the novel elements, right? The non-linearity, the how we view market frictions differently, or increasing returns, etc. So next, I'm going to use one specific paper that I've been working on to illustrate. In the interest of time, I won't talk about details or the modeling technique details at all. So I'm going to just illustrate, this point, right? So I mean, maybe because I'm too kind of down to earth, I always like this kind of professional service sector, right? So I feel like they really take care of us, right? Especially post-COVID, right? Think about food delivery, or even like a haircut, or eye doctor, all sorts of that. They really take care of our lives, right? So this platform is pretty interesting because the founders, it's actually brothers. They started a blog, just sharing some remodeling experiences, but somehow they accumulate a huge customer base. And then gradually, you can imagine, right? So then they turn themselves into a platform, connecting contractors, right? Remodeling and homeowners, right? So that kind of a process. I think people like Feng and Ron, they are very familiar with this. So, but to me, what's interesting is that, as I said, right? So because I'm interested in industry evolution, right? So I'm always curious, the upper left corner, right? So the upper left corner is huge sector of services, professional services, huge, right? So all the way from remodeling to car repair to cosmetic surgery or funeral home, many, right? So, but the thing is that I wonder, right? So in the past, think about the success stories in the platform setting, right? So mostly like, let's say Amazon or Uber, right? I mean, honestly, Uber not that successful in terms of, at least in terms of market value, right? So, in fact, I was presenting at a Feng's conference at the HBS when Lyft just went IPO. So my prediction was that we should all short Lyft. So I was right, actually. But anyway, so but I think this part is still not yet conquered by let's say platform-based model in some way, right? So kind of customized services, right, require some kind of experience or quality, but it's very hard to verify, right? I mean, that's a classic, strategic foundational concept, right? So the kind of market friction, right? So that's how, and the low frequency, in fact, also related to Williamson, who unfortunately just passed away, right? So he's several variables, right? Frequency, or customization, that sort of things. So also I've been reading, I tend to think randomly, so that's why I don't think I have time to present the math. But I've been also reading this book recently during lockdown about the Sicilian Mafia. So that struck me as why is the Sicilian Mafia as a platform owner, right? Because they not only connect the butcher and this kind of a counterparty, right? Breeder, but also he managed quality in some way, right? So as some kind of a governance structure, I think Zhao Luo and Aseem Kaul had paper recently at SMJ, really comparing different kinds of governance forms, right? So I mean, to me, like two questions, right? So why is the Sicilian Mafia as a platform owner? The other is, what's not a platform? Like almost, I think about it, actually anything is a platform. Well, not anything. I mean, most markets or like a wholesaler or it's just that maybe that's how I reflect my own research. Maybe just in the past we just somehow didn't think a lot about the surrounding ecosystem in a non-linear way, right? So either because of data availability or maybe in the past, there it's not as salient as Anpu pointed out, right? So, but anyway, so but this Mafia book actually inspired me to think about this model, right? So again, as I said, I'm not going to talk about details, right? So the perspective, the market friction perspective. So as you can see, right, I would argue that, in online platform setting, indeed, I mean, the focus somewhat different, right? Searching cost, matching cost, etc., right? Feedback, user feedback, like on Amazon would kill, for example, P&G's advertising, right? So definitely there is something unique. But on the other hand, I would say that the fundamental idea, like a market frictions, right? I mean, the strategy field, I mean, at least just a subset of scholars who have done some formal work in this space, right? So, but also the contribution we try to make in this paper is, as I said, right? So Aseem and Zhao did a paper on law and Kaul on kind of a different governance or regulation forms. I would say that the professional services traditionally have been governed by third-party self-regulation organizations like trade associations, etc. Right? But here, the novelty of this paper, I would argue, is that could also be a profit maximizing strategy, right, from a platform perspective. So let me share, these are the kind of remarks about a modeling approach, raw, rich, dog, and also the phenomenon-based, right? So let me spend just a few minutes on the modeling aspect, right? So, I mean, see, that's the thing. That's how I try to illustrate the connection between the corporate strategy research and the platform-based phenomena, right? So, basically, the basic intuition, the model actually I copied from, the textbook literally, right? So this part, right? The basic idea is that, the future, the shadow of the future can help regulate the current behavior. So especially online platform, right? So because if you don't do things well, right? So you're going to have bad user review, and then you are going to be penalized. In the extreme case, you could be kicked out of the platform, right? Be excluded. But the problem is that for this model to work, right? So in the past, we probably didn't need to worry too much about, let's say, delta and gamma, which represent future, right? One is the size of the future benefit. Two is the discount factor. In other words, if you think about it, for the future to work, for the stick to work, the carrot, right, need to be sufficiently appealing. Problem is that in settings like China, right, so that's why I motivated this paper based on China, because the excessive competition, because the weak institutional environment, because for example, people use fake ID, people use shell, we call it a shell ID, right? Or the competition because of historical reasons, right? It's just excessive. So I interviewed quite some business owners in this sector. They're like, who care about future, right? So just let me make some money and just change my IT and then come back again, right? So in other words, if you think about it, the reputation-based mechanism, right? So may not work, maybe defeated by this kind of weak institutional environment, right? Of course, I use this China as extreme, almost prototypical setting to motivate the model, right? So in practice, I would imagine in many service sectors, right? Especially service sector, remember the upper left corner, right? I would imagine the reputation-based mechanism probably defeated as well. And as a result, online platforms and user review, etc., probably won't work, right? So, for us, the basic idea is that just imagine, right? So instead of the government or trade association come in, right? So, let's set a limit, right? So the platform can set a limit upfront, ex ante, right? In other words, just later explain, right? So those on the platform will exert effort in equilibrium, right? And disproportionately more users will come to the platform to seek services, right? While those outside the platform, they just whatever, just Slack or and they get a smaller market share, right? So in other words, the platform can come in and produce the differentiation advantage exposed, even though ex ante they are all homogeneous. Now, the difference from what government and trade association can, or self-organizing association can do, is that here is a profit maximizing, right? As I said, I will talk about details. Yeah.
1 minute left.
Okay, yeah. So the basic idea is that can be profit, but also we have many design features, right? So like entry phase, or like when to how serious the penalty can be, etc. Right? So that's the basic idea of this paper, right? So later, I can share some more details, or I can share a paper with you. But as I said, right? So for this presentation, I just want to really illustrate rich call, right? So like how we can tackle platform-based phenomena, right, or issues through the lens of a corporate strategy. I just serve as a case study. We can continue the discussion during Q&A or breakout.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, next up would be Feng Zhu.
Thank you very much. Oh,
Just go right ahead and start whenever you're ready.
great. Thanks so much to the organizers for putting together this great event and for involving me as a speaker. So I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you a joint research with Xinxin Li, Aseem Valavi, and Marco Yanciti. We're looking at network interconnectivity and entry into platform markets. So as the two speakers are already mentioned that, I mean, we have lots of examples of platform markets today. And when we think about platforms, typically we are kind of envisioning like this kind of two-sided market structure with consumers on one side and app developers or service providers on the other side. And one key feature platforms provide is through doing like searching and matching on both sides. And so, for instance, like Uber is providing services to riders and drivers, and Airbnb is providing services to travelers and hosts. But then if you look at the platform markets, right, even though we talk a lot about like network effects in these markets, winner takes all, the success of these platforms can vary significantly. So here I kind of used some valuation of these platform firms to illustrate this. I used data from the, January of this year to avoid this COVID effect. But if you look at like a platform, sharing economy platforms like Uber, in January 2020, Uber was valued about $50 billion. But as we know, financially, Uber is actually losing billions, right, in the past few years. And another sharing economy company, which tend to be mentioned together with Uber, is Airbnb. And Airbnb's valuation is about $38 billion. But it turns out that the Airbnb, right, is quite special in the sense that the company was actually profitable in 2017 and 2018. And it had some losses, a small loss, right, in 2019 because Airbnb was trying to go IPO this year. So Airbnb, in the end, spent lots of money on acquisition in 2019. And then if you look at the other kind of O2O service providers or sharing economy companies like TaskRabbit, the valuation was much, much lower, 120 million, and eventually got acquired by IKEA. And then if you look at other platforms like Groupon, 10 years ago at its IPO, it was valued at $13 billion. But today, if you look at its valuation, it's only like 10% of its valuation 10 years ago. So we all know from our own kind of conversations with friends or with students that we know that actually platform business models are actually very hard to actually manage. Many platform startups failed to scale up. And also many incumbent platforms, even with network effects, right, couldn't protect themselves very well and struggle to maintain their market positions. So I've been like quite interested in this general question for a while, right? Why do some platforms thrive while others don't? Right? So the angle I in my research tends to like focus a lot on the network structure. Essentially, the perspective here is that to grow a platform successfully is essentially to grow a network very successfully. So some of the network properties can actually have a significant impact on platform's ability to grow its business. So this research was actually inspired by a case I wrote in 2017 about a startup called Fasten. And Fasten is essentially a copycat of Uber and Lyft and entered the Boston market with only 9 million VC investment. And at that time, both Uber and Lyft were valued in billions. But it turns out that Fasten did it very successfully and grow the market very quickly, right? So the special thing about Fasten's business model is that unlike Uber and Lyft, both of them charge 20 to 25% commission rate in Boston. Fasten only charged $1 per trip. And because Fasten charged less, Fasten was able to charge less on the rider side, and also, but still pay more to the drivers. So as a result, many riders and the drivers are multi-homing or switching to Fasten. And in 2017, actually, Fasten claimed that it actually became the first profitable ride-sharing company in the world, ahead of Uber and Lyft. So I was actually quite curious. So I did a case study on this company, and this actually inspired some interesting research questions. Right. So when we look at like Fasten's network structure or Uber's network structure, and it's actually quite different from the network structure of Airbnb or Booking.com or eBay. So when we look at Uber's network structure, for instance, and these networks are all very clustered in the sense that, Boston drivers are going to be matched with Boston riders. And usually if you don't travel frequently, like people in Boston are not going to care too much about, for instance, Uber's market share in San Francisco, because if they don't go there. And similarly, drivers in Boston are not going to care too much about Uber's market share outside Boston. It's all about a local matching. And versus in the Airbnb case or Booking.com case, the situation is very different. It's quite the opposite. in the sense that if you're a traveler, right, if you are trying to use Airbnb, you actually don't really care about the number of hosts in Boston because you are not going to stay, right, at another place in the same city. You actually care about the number of properties Airbnb has outside of Boston. And similarly, if you are the host in Boston, you probably care a lot about the number of travelers coming, right, from the rest of the world to Boston, rather than the number of Airbnb users in Boston, because you don't expect them to actually use your service. And the same is true for Booking.com. And so as a result, if you look at like the differences in these network structures, you will find that they look quite differently, and this actually affects their defensibilities, in the sense that if you have a quite clustered network structure, and then a new entrant could actually enter and concentrate on its effort on a local market and put up a reasonable competition with the incumbent. Versus if you are actually having a very global network structure, then it may be difficult for a newcomer to come to challenge, like for instance, Airbnb Booking, because a newcomer would have essentially to scale a global network, essentially not only growing the number of hosts in Boston, but also growing the number of travelers outside Boston, and make sure that they are interested in using the platform and to be matched to the host in Boston. So it's actually going to be a lot challenging. So we decided to actually kind of do a systematic study with a game theoretical model. It turns out that during our literature review, we found that pretty much all models on platforms all assume basically a globally connected network structure. And then we also look at like models on even on non-platform companies. We didn't see much work looking at this network clustering structures. And even though in that setting, the story is a lot simpler in the sense that we don't have to worry about this two-sided matching, and we don't have to worry about network effects in such markets. So I will save you from all the mathematics, but I will briefly describe this model setup here. So the goal is to model essentially a competitive interaction between an incumbent firm, think of it as Uber, for instance, with operations in multiple markets, and also an entrant seeking to enter one of these markets, right? Think of it as Fasten. And the entrant can advertise to the market to build awareness of this platform, and both on the rider side and also on the driver side. And we also assume that there's some interconnectivity across the markets, in the sense that some people, right? So some people are traveling across the markets, right? For instance, people from San Francisco may come to Boston. Boston people may go to San Francisco, and they could use Uber services. Or if they come to Boston, they could also use Fasten services. So markets are interconnected in the case that some of the buyers actually are mobile buyers. So with this simple model, we actually derived several predictions. And to my surprise, actually, even though we did this modeling after I interviewed Fasten, then after we had all these results, I went back to like basically the case. I found that these predictions are highly consistent with what I observed during the case study. So the first prediction was that even if there was no cost for the entrant to build awareness, right? So basically advertising can be free, right? And the entrant actually will not want to build awareness among the whole population, in the sense that the Fasten may not want to advertise to everybody in Boston about its existence. And the reason is that if you do that, it actually triggers competitive response from the incumbent Uber. And during my interview with Fasten, its founders repeatedly told me that it's not their goal to be number one or number two in the market. They just want to be number three after Uber and Lyft. And they want to kind of stay small so that they don't kind of compete fiercely with Uber, because, I mean, this is a battle they don't think they're going to win.
5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, great. And we also noticed that from the model, having a large number of mobile buyers essentially having a greater interconnectivity between markets can actually reduce incumbents' incentive to launch a price war against the new entrant. But in this case, it will still increase the incumbent's profit. The incentive is that if there are lots of travelers coming from, say, San Francisco to Boston, and these travelers are only aware of Uber because Uber was available in San Francisco. They have no idea about Fasten unless Fasten try to advertise to them. And as a result, for these travelers, it's actually a captive market for Uber in the sense that Uber is behaving almost like a monopoly. So as a result, when this segment increases, then it actually can reduce Uber's incentive to lower the price in Boston because it's going to reduce Uber's ability to capture value from these travelers. So this actually reduces Uber's incentive to launch a price war for Fasten. In other words, a well-connected market may incentivize more entrants to enter because of this lack of incentive to fight. And finally, we also discovered that stronger network effects in general can actually help deter entry. And actually it's beneficial for the incumbent. So this is also what happened to Fasten in the sense that in 2018, even though in 2017, Fasten started to kind of make some profit, in 2018, Fasten decided to exit the US market after the acquisition by a Russian company. And the reason with this exit was really because Uber and Lyft both strengthened the network effects through their offering of the pooling services in Boston. And the pooling services took off very rapidly in Boston. So if you think about the pooling services, essentially at any time when a rider is requesting a car, the platform will try to match the rider with someone else who is traveling at the same time, is going in the same direction, right? And put them in the same car. And it turns out that with the introduction of pooling services, it's essentially introducing some kind of a same-side network effects in the sense that then the installed base becomes more relevant, right? And the larger installed base can allow these incumbents to match much better than the new entrants. And Fasten, even though it's profitable at that time, but because of its smaller scale, couldn't offer such services, and in the end decided to actually exit the market. So the takeaway from this study, right? So essentially, we are recommending that for any platforms, they should think about their network structure, and if possible, they should try to build a more globally connected network structure to be more defensible. And here are some examples, right? Think about the Craigslist. And the Craigslist is, you could think, is really a low quality classified ad website. If you go to its website, you just couldn't believe this is like the interface you are seeing in 2020. But the Craigslist is still doing well after so many years. And part of the reason is that even though you could think that, oh, Craigslist is operating in a very fragmented market, but there are lots of interconnectivity across these different clusters in the sense that if you think about the Craigslist the services like housing, job listings, it actually attracts lots of users from other markets. Right, so this actually increased the interconnectivity across the markets for Craigslist. And then if you think about like Facebook is also quite clustered in the sense that we tend to only social with the people we know. We don't social with strangers frequently. So in order to overcome this kind of clustered structure, Facebook introduced, like for instance, things like social games, so that it actually allows strangers to play with each other. And so this actually increased essentially the interconnectivity across different clusters. And Facebook also introduced, for instance, the company pages so that the strangers can also interact on these pages. So these activities all increased essentially the defensibility of these platforms. So I would stop here. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Feng. Appreciate it. Appreciate all of our keynote speakers for presenting these papers. So we now have 10 minutes for Q&A. Please post your questions in the chat window and then I'll call on you. And if your question is addressed to a specific speaker, then please specify which speaker you're asking. So I think the first question is from Jordi Casanova. Jordy, would you like to ask your question yourself, or should I read it out for you? I know where he is. Let's see. Jordy, are you there? Okay, well, I'll read it then because he doesn't seem to be speaking up. So this question is for Anpu. He says, thanks for your paper. I think you very well identified a trade-off that seems to be forgotten by policymakers. There's a trade-off between the amount of personal data shared by users, i.e. privacy, and the quality of the platform, i.e. more personalization increases value for advertisers and increases earnings of the platform, which it can use to improve user-side quality of the platform. My question is about actual preferences of consumers on that trade-off. The CMA 2020 report shows that consumers have significantly increased the number of times they click on targeted ads provided by Google, which may be interpreted by them as valuing more targeted advertising provided thanks to a more personalized data. A small online search engine such as DuckDuckGo, which does not offer personalized ads, has a 0.5% worldwide market share. So, one, doesn't this show that consumers prefer platforms that personalize ads? And two, how well equipped are consumers to understand the trade-off between privacy and platform quality? I'll turn it over to Anpu to unmute and answer that question.
Right, thank you very much, Rich. So I think one of the core challenges I think in this platform-based business models is that many of them create substantial amount of consumer surplus for the people that you participate in the platforms. So it comes with several challenges. One is that people oftentimes indicate their priority and their concerns about the privacy concerns, but they actually illustrate as their privacy concerns. For example, in the survey samples, we see that what they indicate as their privacy and actually what they do in the platforms seem to be substantially different from each other. So possibly a generational question which is related to which we as strategy scholars can probably contribute also is that how do we really understand what consumers actually want in the platforms, and how do we strategize, take back and step back out and strategize how do we able to contribute to what they would probably want while giving privacy preferences they would want. So in addition, this also relates to the question in our paper, when we imply that privacy concerns put up upper cap of on the synergies. To do that, the platforms do need to have the capabilities to be able to provide. Now, if you don't have the capabilities to sometimes provide this synergistically exploring this information functions and provide products and services in the platform, they would oftentimes end up just doing purely one of the functions they could do with the capabilities that they have. Then oftentimes they end up being a very niche platform. And as Feng just mentioned in his presentation also, they could be very content with being a very niche platform, being a third or fourth player in the market, but actually having a certain subset of complementers on the supply side and the users on the other side participating. So DuckDuckGo, as you mentioned, is a good example. But I think more broadly, it leads to a question about really understanding how demand side perspective of the users can be incorporated into a broader strategic framework so that we could actually identify the trade-offs that comes with the privacy and the non-privacy preferences that we can see here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anpu. The next question is for Feng. This question is from Alfonso Amaral. Alfonso, would you like to read the question yourself? If so, then just...
Sure. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I really like the way you addressed this topic of the network effects. My question is quite general, which is, from your perspective, what other aspects would you think are relevant in the platform market that would deter new players, that would raise entry barriers for new players in this market? That's my question.
And you mean factors other than network effects?
Yeah, exactly. Apart from.
Yeah. So So certainly, like there could be like lots of factors you can think about, just even for like non-platform settings, right? So like some kind of IP or technology advantages that these are all like can create some barrier to entry. But specific to platforms, you could think of other factors, such as, for instance, the switching cost, right? How easy is it for people switching from an incumbent platform to a new platform? So, and this could be a potential entry barrier. And how easy it is for players, right, participants to multi-home on both sides of the market, in the sense that they could adopt both platforms at the same time. Right? These are all the factors, we should all think about. One of the reasons why in the ride-sharing setting, like for instance, it's so much easier to enter a market like this is because many of the drivers, many of the riders can easily multi-home. Right? Essentially, they could download another app and they could be on multiple apps, right? Like for riders and also for drivers. Drivers can have multiple apps open, and then when they get the order from one platform, they just turn off the other app and then take the order. So this ease of multi-homing certainly is a very important factor in many platform markets.
Thank you so much for your comment. Thank you.
Russ Gentiles, the next one, has a question, I think that's addressed to all of the speakers, saying, can speakers provide one or two more examples of strong network effects proven to enhance a barrier to entry? So I'll throw that open to any of the speakers.
Maybe I can take a shot. And so network effects, I mean, even though if you look at many empirical papers, they try to estimate network effects in some platform markets and tell you, oh, the number is 0.3. But the network effects are typically not static for a given market, can evolve or can change according to platform strategies. So if you take like Amazon, for example, Amazon actually employs multiple types of network effects. So if you think about, so that's why actually network effects on Amazon is quite strong these days. And so if you think about the product review offered by Amazon, this is almost like a same side network effects in the sense that the more users or more purchases made on Amazon, it's actually beneficial to the next buyer because you could actually read the product reviews. And Amazon also has started this marketplace, which introduced essentially indirect network effects in the sense that the more users of Amazon also incentivize the more third-party sellers to show up on Amazon. And the more third-party sellers will induce more users. And today, more than half of the products actually on Amazon are actually sold by third-party sellers. And Amazon also leverages data to generate what I would refer to as data network effects, in the sense that the more transactions, more interactions on Amazon.com, and Amazon has more data. So Amazon actually can predict a particular user's behavior better. So if you go to Amazon, the interface, the product recommendation you are seeing are actually different from the interface I'm seeing when I go onto Amazon, because Amazon has all this data. So this actually generates this kind of data network effects in the sense that the more you do on Amazon, the better Amazon can predict your behavior and can provide this recommendation better. So this is also another positive feedback loop. So the combination of these all three kinds of network effects really help like generate very strong network effects for a platform like Amazon.
Okay, thank you, Feng. So we have 4 questions in the chat window and only 3 minutes left for the Q&A period. So I think what I'm going to do is do one more question here, and then encourage the speakers to look through the chat window for questions that are addressed to them in particular, and reach out to those people who've asked the questions either through the chat window or through email or something to get those questions answered. Okay, so the next question then that's addressed to all speakers is from Valerie Chandna, and she asks, do you feel that post-pandemic platforms that host businesses like online marketplaces may see a spike in interest with businesses finding that these platforms mitigate some risk for them? So generally the effect of the post-pandemic period on platforms and their risks that they incur. Any of the speakers?
Yeah, I can take a shot here. Especially another participant asked me to read his question to me because he can't unmute. Yeah, so I think indeed, right, like those small businesses like restaurants, right, so they probably need more help from DoorDash or Postmates, right, so this kind of platform. Indeed, that's value added. But you know, I just want to also point out that, you know, very quickly, you know, just imagine, right, there are too many users, small restaurants, right, join the platform. The competition there would be fierce too. In other words, I'm not so sure, right? So if everybody owns access to a platform, there is no competitive advantage, right? So that's strategy 101, right? Rich has done a lot of work in that space, right? So in other words, I study skill-free capabilities a lot. So my big concern with this kind of platform-based model is that, yes, it's skill-free, right? So everybody can get access, right? So it's great for Amazon, but I'm not so sure it's great for you know, those complementers, right? Because everybody has access, right? It's bad, right? So that's you know, my biggest concern, as you said, right? So even post-COVID, I want to be very careful if I were a small business owner, right? So the question, you know, one participant asked me in chat box is, you know, the user review, right? So in addition to matching, you know, connecting function, right? So the user review, you know, what's the value of that? Like a Yelp rating, right? Similarly for restaurants. So again, I agree with the positive aspect of user rating or online platforms. Absolutely. Like as I said, right? So I think right now, one of the companies that hate Amazon most, probably not Walmart, it should be P&G, right? So really, like, you know, advertising is no value, right? So they cannot, you know, cheat us that, oh, they're like, you know, detergent is the best, right? So user review can do the job. But for many other services, as I explained, I think a lot of the services, if you go back to Williamson's classic work, right? So I just, I still think a lot of, I would say, yeah, really a lot of the sectors, right, just can't use this form, right? So either because, let's say, the transaction frequency is too low, right? So it takes time to accumulate user feedback, right? But also, let's say, the degree of customization, right? I mean, it's hard to really make a clear-cut assessment based on user feedback, a particular user, right? So different people have different tastes, right? So the problem, especially difficult for, let's say, as I said, there are certain industries or certain countries where, because of historical reasons, right, it kind of start from a bad position. Now, even if the user review can, you know, help the evolution, right, toward a better equilibrium, it might get stuck, right, in a bad state, in a bad equilibrium, right? So in other words, maybe because I come from China, I always doubt user reviews. I just very often I don't trust it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brian. Okay, everybody, welcome back. So now we will have a panel consisting of 5 panelists. And we will go in almost alphabetical order. We'll go in alphabetical order, except that Ron Adner has asked to go last. So our first panelist is David Collis, and we'll go with 10 minutes per panelist. Go ahead, David. Take it over whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Rich. Let me try this. Come on. There we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this session. a little bit like Brian said, you know, I'm a corporate strategy person rather than a platform person. So my insights, if anything, come from more classic traditional corporate strategy. And I'm thinking more recently about platform-based business models. So I'm not the expert on platforms that I think you'll begin to see towards the end of the presentation here. I also thought, because I was going first, I would say just a little bit about the other papers and try and relate them and use that as a way to then introduce some novel ideas myself. I just did this a while ago. You can see it goes 2017. I always think it's interesting just to see the phenomenon we're studying. You know, back in 1962, platforms referred to railroad stations, you know, and you can see the huge takeoff in the reference in the literature to platforms. So it clearly is an important and a recent phenomenon here. I just looked at the three papers and they all have similar structure, actually. They all start off with a piece talking about the phenomenon itself. What are platforms? Why do they exist? And so on. And then they actually each one take a look at one of those classic corporate strategy questions that Rich identified, Emily having highlighted, this one about sort of scope. So the first paper looked at scope across, if I can call it, parts of the value chain. The second one looked at scope across how many service providers we want on our platform. And the third one, Feng's one, obviously looked at scope across geographies. So they all had a similar structure. Let's look at the phenomenon and then let's look at, and the analytical paper, part of the paper was around scope. What's the phenomenon they're all looking at? Again, everyone says how it's technologically enabled. They always existed. What's happened is that modern technology enables this location-independent, fungible, scale-free, almost zero cost. So we get, because communication, computing, storage costs have gone down, we get this sort of anywhere, anytime, any device interactivity. That's sort of the phenomenon we're looking at. I thought the interesting thing, helpful to me actually, was teed off in the first paper, Anpu's paper, but Brian reiterated it as well, that what's really going on here, what's the advantage of a platform? Why are they taking off? Because of these technologically enabled reductions, they reduce the frictions in the transactions. Anpu and Rich called it coordination, search, and trust, the three aspects, the three functions, or the three value-added roles, if you will, that platforms perform. I'm always looking for alliteration. So my alliteration here is, what are the three, what do they enable you to do in a way you can't without the presence of the platform? Meet, you've obviously got to find other people, that's the coordination. Match, that's the search part. And then maybe a little bit sexist in this day and age, but the third one is mate. You've actually got to come together and trust the other person and complete the transaction. So what do? They help you meet, match, and mate. And again, all three papers basically start from that as the phenomenon. That's the way they think about the value of the platform and why technologically enabled they're becoming so more important. They then each go and look at this notion of corporate scope. And here is interesting. The first paper, I took Rich's name rather than Anpu's here, I apologize, looks really at the synergies or the integration, the scope of the firm across these three roles or these three stages in the value chain. Again, their coordination, search, trust, or for me, you know, meet, match, and mate. And a couple of things struck me. And again, with all of these, the inherently interesting, the results they find. But, you know, eBay bought PayPal. You know, that's an example of, you know, moving into the trust part of it, and then spun off PayPal. You know, they're going in and out there. It's not just one dimensional. Scope is increasing and then decreasing. You know, eBay facilitates the transaction, the meet and the match, and then the PayPal does the payment side of things. That's the sort of mating, the completion of it. You know, interestingly enough, in different institutional structures, like in Latin America, basically the eBay of Latin America, there were two of them, one was Deramate, had to do payments because there was no broad payment mechanism in Latin America, in emerging markets. But then what struck me was, but heck, look, Macy's, a traditional store, has to decide whether or not to offer a credit card. You know, there's the transaction one going into the payment one as well. You know, WeChat, in contrast, you know, was very much, you know, in payments from the very beginning. Yet we do see, even in the same functional, you know, this notion of scope expanding and contracting. And your paper looks at the impact of privacy on what happens to the synergy. The same thing could be true of Macy's credit card. You know, the privacy, yeah, your concerns, you know, hacking into your social security number through Macy's. What does that do for whether or not Macy's wants to have a credit card? Brian looked at, you know, scope across the number of providers on a platform, with the idea that logically what should happen is the platform itself, in these cases of low frequency and high customization, should limit the number of providers so that you don't get the sort of free riding aspect of low quality competitors, providers appearing on it. And that's true. That's on the other hand, there's also this negative externality on the demand side as well. The classic one for me is Burberry, that lost its exclusivity when it opened up and sold the Burberry brand in, you know, all the different discount stores and discount retail. Burberry then turned itself around by refocusing on a much more exclusive channel of distribution. So that's a demand side, intentional limitation of the scope of who we sell to, not the intentionally limiting the number of people that are allowed to be on our platform, but an analog there. And then Feng, obviously, and he referred to this in his presentation, looks at this difference between, is this a local versus a global market? You know, what is the degree of connectivity between different geographies? And that's a classic question. A long time ago, I did stuff with industrial gas distribution. You know, this is the oxygen, you know, cylinders for car shops. Is that a local business or is that a national business? You know, nothing to do with network effects. It's just, and again, Feng alluded to this, there's just cost side, supply side, scale economies that might say it could be a global or a national market versus a purely local market. It could be on the customer side. Some of the gas distributors were themselves present across the US. And then, yeah, all the McDonald's always has to take into account this question of interconnectivity, mobility of customers when they're thinking about where to locate their next store. You know, if we go too close, we cannibalize ourselves. You know, and then McDonald's has the same phenomenon of, yeah, if you know, in a particular location, like in, you know, in the Grand Canyon, there's probably a lot of tourists there. So the percentage of mobile customers is a lot higher. They can think about pricing and so on differentially there. So again, all three papers ended up looking at the analysis of corporate scope. To me, and this is, you know, this is not good or bad. My question, though, a little bit is, okay, so are these outcomes, are these findings unique to platforms? You know, in some level, I'm saying no, they're not. You know, they're analogs in the non-platform world, and I think in many ways, actually, this is good. You know, what we're being able to do is we're being able to morph over or port over, I should say, from things we've learnt about, you know, scope in a more classic setting to be able to say some interesting things about scope in a platform sense. You know, on the other hand, yeah, you know, it's not that different. It's not that different is my conclusion there. What I do want to go back to, though, is, and here I want to just add a little bit of my own spin here, is back to the beginning of the papers, the phenomenon. And here I've pulled the three sort of what I thought were the core figures from each of the papers. The first one that Anpu had around the three roles or functions. The second one around from Brian around the frequency versus the degree of customization of the service offering. And then the third one from Feng about the degree of interconnectivity. You know, those to me were here we're now trying to think a little bit more about what's really going on underlying a platform, what's happening with what's the platform doing. And to me, that was a little bit missing from all of these, in that they're all treating platforms as somehow the same. You know, it doesn't quite matter what the platform is doing here. It's a platform, and therefore everything must be the same because it's a platform. And you know, I've been thinking, and I don't think that's right. I think there are different platforms because there are different business models in platforms, and a different business model for me starts with a different job to be done. You know, this is the sort of Clay Christensen. More formally, and I have a piece in HBR coming out around this, around sort of business models and a broader context anyway. But to me, what's a business model? It starts from what's the function provided to the client, what's the job to be done. There's a critical part about the monetization method. How do you monetize? And then the supply side, what assets do you have to have in place to deliver the business? And you know, I'm not going to talk, you can clearly see differences here between Uber and taxis or Airbnb and hotels. That's not what I want. But that to me is a business model. Every firm should have a business model. Many firms can have the same one. Different business models compete for the same customer. That's taxes. To me, it's actually getting very close to the old notion, this notion of business models, to strategic groups. You know, in the old days, we used to talk about strategic groups. You know, it was the national branded CPG companies and then the private labels. And they were different strategic groups. That's a different business model in sort of the current vernacular. And everyone should have a unique strategy, and everyone should have a different strategy. But why am I saying that? Because I think business model is an important idea here. And because I think, and this, I just throw this out. This is, you know, preliminary thinking. This is not definitive by any means. But back to the sort of what's the function? What's the job to be done? What are these platforms doing? It seems to me there's sort of three types of platform. And you know, don't quote me on this, almost, you know, feel free to disagree. But when I look around, you know, and again, I'm big on alliteration here. So, you know, what have I got? I've got commodities, content, or community, transactions, technology, or tribe. What do I mean? I think there are three different sorts. The transaction or the commodity one, that's Amazon. You know, basically it's an exchange. You know, I'm selling something or other people are selling something. You know, that's what the platform does. Content or the tribe, the content or jump to the other one, community or the tribe. To me, that's Facebook. You know, that's the peer-to-peer. You know, it's a very different, you know, you upload your own content. You know, it's the social group, it's the social network that matters here. And to me, that's a very different sort of platform than Amazon. And then the third one is the one that I think Rich and Anpu had as that sort of core of doing all three things. It's the content one, or what I call the technology one. It's sort of the iPhone. You know, it's the core technology that other people can hang lots of stuff around. So, you know, whether I'm right, whether there are three, whether there are four, I don't know. You know, whether it's commodities, content, community, you know, transactions, technology or tribe, who care? I just think there are different sorts of platform that do fundamentally different jobs. And why is that so important? Because I think then we can get a little bit further in understanding some of these core questions. You know, the monetization scheme is going to be different, but I think particularly given the three papers looked at scope, which is one of the fundamental questions of corporate strategy. If we think about the transaction or the commodity type of business model, here I'm thinking Amazon or Uber or even Airbnb, you typically monetize it by taking a little cut of the business. That's very different than how the others monetize their business model. But the interesting thing is, I think the assets, what assets do you actually bring to bear here? I always remember in Internet 1.0, every single MBA student came up with a 17-slide PowerPoint presentation around there were going to be an exchange. And it was literally an exchange. It was just the platform. And, you know, it would be for for industrial paints, and anyone buying industrial paints would interact with all the suppliers of industrial paints from around the world, and they take their little cut. That's a pure exchange, you know, and what was involved in it, minimal technology. That was why it was a 17-slide PowerPoint presentation. If you think about what's happened now, the extreme is Amazon. The asset base Amazon has in place here now is like 50 fulfillment centers. They're now up to getting close to 100 airplanes. Just think what they've built in terms of the traditional heavy, and now of course they own what's the Whole Foods, you know, they're even think about what the asset scope choice underlying the same basic functionality of, yeah, we're providing, you know, a way you can buy things online. At the tribe or the community level, you know, here I'm thinking Facebook, Twitter, or the one I like is the Guardian newspaper, because I did some stuff with them. How do you monetize it? Typically via advertising. You know, there's the wonderful quote when, what's his name? Zuckerberg was being hauled up in front of the Senate, and you know, someone said, how do you make money when your thing is free? And he looked at him and he said, Senator, we sell advertising. You know, that's the classic way these ones monetize it. But again, think about the scope choice they've made. And here, Facebook basically trying to say, we don't intervene whatsoever. You know, it's any content goes up there, it's your content, we can't be held liable for it. Twitter has gone much more the curation route. We've invested heavily in curation. And the Guardian has gone even further and now offer services and events themselves to their own community. Again, same sort of functionality, but a very different asset scope that they've chosen. And then the technology or the content one, and here, you know, I pick up on iPhone. I'm thinking also about someone like NCR that now has, you know, traditionally did the ATMs, you know, but now does all the devices when you check in at the airport and so on. Or Komatsu, the earth moving equipment company, where they now build platforms. And the interesting thing about these ones is they have to make a fundamental choice here, again, around sort of asset scope. What do we do with the data? NCR says we won't touch your data. You can imagine the amount of data they're getting from all the ATMs they have around the world, from all the, you know, online check-in booths on airports. And so they've said absolutely no data. Another one, Kone Crane, builds a platform, again, where everyone with Kone, not Crane, sorry, the elevator company, they've said, we're going to take the data, we're going to use the data, we're going to resell the data. Again, a fundamentally different choice of asset scope here. You know, that's where I want to end up. Again, I'm not a platform person. I do think we're missing out some way of trying to categorize different types of platform business models. They're not all the same. You know, a transaction one is different than a tribe or a community one. And I think the important question for us that in fact all three papers looked at, and I'm pushing a little bit further here, is at the end of the day, what's the underlying asset scope that you choose in your platform business model? Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm doing a terrible job as timekeeper, I confess. So let's move directly to Claudine.
All right, can everybody hear me? Okay. Let me see. Okay, great. So Rich, since you're the host of hosts, can you see my screen okay and hear me okay?
Good to go, and it looks very nice. And I'll,
okay, beautiful.
For our speakers, I'll send you little time reminders through the chat window.
Okay, or just feel free to interrupt and tell me. Okay, beautiful. So firstly, thank you to Rich and to these to all the organizers for inviting me and for pulling us all together. I think all of us right now are sort of feeling the 5-month-old sort of wearing of the sort of houseboundness, and just being able to get together in whatever fashion and feign that we're at AOM, I think is good for all of us. So thank you again. One brief disclaimer, today is the day that my internet has decided to act up. So if I get cut off or whatnot, bear with me and I'll do my best. Okay, all right, so with that, without further ado, let me get going. All right, so just briefly, some context for my excuse me, let me just get this out of the way, for my own comments. So my name is Claudine Gartenberg. I'm at Wharton, and I focus on the organizational side of corporate strategy. And so I'm going to focus some of my comments today on sort of what do I think some of the interesting organizational areas are for studying platforms. And when you think of organizational strategy, which fits into corporate strategy, thinking about formal and informal structure, incentives, governance, sort of the people side, the individual side of corporate of strategy. And so the question that I approached today's comments from was, what are the important organizational strategies or challenges that I think are particularly salient in platform businesses? And I'm not could be that some of you, but I think what we'll see is that it's not necessarily magnified in this context. And so the way to think about this is, instead of the firm being an N of one, now the firm is an N of N, where the N is the number of employees or individuals, or we're unpacking the inside the organizational context of platform businesses and asking ourselves, what are some other interesting questions that arise by doing so, by unpacking the inside of the firm. So with that, I actually thought of two interesting categories that I think are promising for researchers on this call. Those of us that are interested in this topic. Not all of these are true to my organizational side. So I think there's very interesting research areas associated with the challenges of scale, which is, again, not always an organizational question, but I think we've ceded this territory to economics, and I don't think we should. I think there's managerial and strategic questions that arrive from just the sheer scale of some of these platform businesses that I think that there's research that we should be doing here. And then there's a second category of the challenges of non-contractability that you can also reframe in terms of transaction costs, but I think of it more as non-contractability that I'll get to in a second. So before I jump into these two challenges, just a quick mini case that I think illustrates where some of these interesting questions come up. And here the mini case is actually contrasting not platform versus platform, where a lot of the previous conversations happened, but traditional business models, to use David's terminology, and platform businesses. And so let's just take a couple minutes here. And here I actually want to give a big hat tip to David Collis, who's written some of HBS's and the industry's best cases on corporate strategy. For those of you that are looking to teach corporate strategy, look for his cases. They're fantastic. And I recently taught one of his cases on Amazon versus Walmart. And I think some of the issues that are illustrated by this are relevant for us in terms of research. So I just got done with teaching a strategy implementation class to my MBAs. And we spent a day on Walmart versus Amazon. And we asked, if you were Walmart, should you be worried that Amazon is going to pose a mortal threat to you? And of course, most people raised their hand. The assumption is that there's going to be this continuation of this cycle of retailing, just one generation of retailers overturning another generation, and Walmart is going to be sort of slain by the new Goliath, which is Amazon, given its platform model. And part of the point of our discussion, and what comes out by the end of it, is that actually a traditional business model has several advantages over these platform models, and that there's very viable competition that can happen between these two firms. That's one insight. And the second insight that comes from this is, what do we actually mean by platforms? And I'm wondering whether in a decade from now, as we meet from AOM, whether platforms are just going to be subsumed into larger corporate strategy, that there's going to be interesting hybrid models, and that the boundaries between what we call a platform business and a not platform business are going to become so blurred that it's going to be hard for us to distinguish between the two of them. And so just to illustrate the first point of the viability of Walmart competing against Amazon, when you look at the scope, so this is where corporate strategy fits in. When you look at the scope of what Walmart invests in, look at what they offer, right? So you can see prepared foods, garden center with plants, tax preparation, nail salons, tech support, are on-site services that are very hard for Amazon to compete against. Similarly, when you look at recent patents that Walmart has gotten into, and again, you can look at this as sort of technological scope that they're getting into, these are all patents that relatively benefit on-site stores, that disadvantage Amazon and that advantage Walmart. So when you think about the nature of competition, Walmart is able to compete where services and high-touch products matter, think grocery, and it's also able to compete where in-store experience matters more. And what these companies are getting into is this, and I think we underplay this when we teach strategy, it's a type of differentiated cost competition. So in the sense that customers are cost conscious in terms of price, but also in terms of time, and we have different time preferences. And there are ways that Walmart can effectively compete on a cost basis for those of us that have certain time preferences, like we want to drive into a store, get high touch services, a one-stop shop for what Walmart can get. So in that sense, platforms are not, you know, an end-all be-all, and there's very interesting lessons to be learned about the nature of scope and how traditional business models can compete against platforms. And just to make that very clear, Amazon is getting, you know, from a scope extension, is getting heavily into healthcare. When they announced their acquisition of about a $700 million acquisition of an online pharmacy, every segment pretty much of the healthcare business was massively affected. Insurers, PBMs, drug wholesalers, retailers, with the exception of Walmart. Walmart was the one competitor that didn't see a big hit that day, and partly because there's effective competition between traditional companies and platform companies. So anyway, getting back to sort of general lessons in areas that I think we can take advantage of. Let me just skip over this because Rich is telling me I've got 2 minutes, so hold on. So one is that there's differences between platforms and product businesses. Platforms very much benefit scale, but there's also a lot of similarities. There's difference in the way they compete that we should think about as researchers. I'm going to start zipping through because I want to get some of the organizational pieces in here, and they also compete on an organizational level. Now, let me very quickly talk about these two challenges that I think it's important for us as researchers to grapple with, particularly in strategy and management. Number one is scale. So when you look at the global top 10 by market cap between 1997 and 2019, it is completely transformed to businesses that at least have some version of a platform inside of them, whether they're fully or partially or what percentage of it is unclear. But it's being dominated by platform businesses. So the question here is, oh, and by the way, just quickly, this is second quarter this year. Look at, we have $2.5 trillion companies that are platform businesses. It's unbelievable. So the questions here are, you know, these are companies that marshal the resources of nations. What are the implications for corporate strategy in general? So what do we think, do we have new lessons to learn about diversification? What is really related in these contexts? You know, it's no longer sort of SIC relatedness. So do we need new ideas of what related is? How should we think about the increase of blending of business models? As I've talked about, neither Amazon is not a pure platform, Walmart is not a pure traditional company. So how are these models blending into each other? David talked about this. How should we think about open versus closed platform businesses? There's some businesses that depend on opening up their data, others that depend on proprietary data. How should we think about that? And stakeholder strategy, which is that some of these businesses have conflicts built into the center of them. Facebook is one, Etsy is another. How should we think about how these businesses manage these conflicts? Then on the organizational side, so unpacking, so the N is no longer one, but it's the employees in the firm. What is the role of metrics in these large companies that are diversified? And also, can we think of new lessons around centralization and decentralization? So I would be willing to bet that all of the older lessons around centralization, decentralization don't necessarily translate as cleanly to these contexts and are worth studying in a platform business. Challenge two, and I'm going to zip through this. Platforms are new ways of organizing. How should we think about non-contractables? So the relationships are shifting from employees to market participants that are managed by algorithms and ratings. How should we think about what we're losing as part of that. We are now losing the benefits of a lot of soft information, and what is the implications for knowledge creation, for adaptability. Okay, that is all. I'm gonna skip over the last slide. But you know, my point here is very similar, I think, to David's. I don't think there's a lot of new issues, but I think there are some known challenges that are magnified where we might have different lessons here, and there's lots of opportunity for research in this area. So thank you for inviting me, and enjoy the rest of the session.
Thanks very much, Claudine. Next up is Aseem Kaul. Take it over, Aseem, whenever you're ready.
Here we go. Okay, everybody see my screen and hear me okay? Which I'm looking at you, yeah. You know, I have the dubious distinction of being the third person, or maybe even the fourth person, depending on how Claudine counts herself, who is really a corporate strategy person who's been dragged kicking and screaming into sort of looking at platforms. And I originally signed up to be a discussant for this virtual PDW, and then I got upgraded to a panelist, which was not an upgrade. It's sort of not quite the same quality of upgrade as, you know, flying. And so, you know, I was sort of focusing on Rich's original prompt of sort of thinking about, is there something new here? Is this just the same old hat? You know, I spent a little bit of time muttering to myself saying, this is all just corporate strategy. I don't know what you people are talking about. Right, and I was sort of focusing on this lovely XKCD cartoon about municipal pumping as on-demand Hyperloop style water delivery as a business model. But then, you know, I think where I've ended up, which I think is consistent with the points that Claudine and David have already made, is I really think a lot of the questions that we've traditionally asked in corporate strategy apply to thinking about platform businesses. I think the answers to those questions are potentially different because of the nature of the phenomenon. And so what my thesis today and my focus is going to be, how do we take the traditional questions we ask in corporate strategy? And to me, there are really three questions, right? What is it that we're comparing this firm to, right? So we think about diversified firms, we compare them to single business firms, etc. So what's the counterfactual? What are the capabilities that allow this entity, this diversified firms, to create value relative to that counterfactual? And what activities does that entail the organization needs to undertake through its corporate office, for example, in some of David's work, etc. And then, you know, given the nature of capabilities that we're relying on to create value, what are the transaction costs that are implied by those capabilities, both in terms of internal coordination costs and in terms of coordinating across markets? And that, of course, then brings us all the way back to counterfactuals, because, of course, the alternate organizational form to be thinking about is itself a function of what the transaction costs are. And so I'm just going to walk through each one of these and give some examples of how I think we can use this kind of thinking to better inform our research about platforms. Let's start with counterfactuals, right? So here you have your sort of canonical two-sided platform, right? There's two sides, the platform matches them up. The obvious kind of counterfactual is just a direct transaction, right? So one person on side one matches to another person on side two, and they just do a spot market transaction on their own. This is really, in my mind, the spirit of Anpu's paper as well as Brian's paper. This is really the counterfactual that they're focusing on, and that's fine. There's a different counterfactual, which is a different platform, right? So if you were to think about this as Uber, the direct transaction, I mean, the closest approximation to a direct transaction would be something like hailing a cab, right? An individual driver gets matched to an individual passenger. The alternate platform option would be something like Lyft or Fasten or whatever, right? Where there's a different provider, and that could be an existing provider, it could be a potential entrant, right? So we need to think about the threat of entry as we're familiar with. But those are not the full set of counterfactuals, right? A third counterfactual is integration, right? So even in the Uber case, which you usually think about integration, you could, depending on how rich you are, hire a driver to just drive you around, and that would be integration. Arguably, you could get your family to drive you around, and arguably that's a form of integration. You could also imagine relational contracts, right? So before Uber, you needed to go to the airport, you asked a friend to give you a lift, right? And that, so that's another sort of organizational arrangement that is a potential counterfactual. We can also think about hierarchy differently, right? So we can think about, in the absence of the platform, the two sides would not look the same. The absence of the platform, it might be the case that one side or both sides were far more consolidated under hierarchies, right? So again, think about Uber, the old model of taxi cabs versus Uber. Taxi cabs are far more consolidated. The drivers are part of a hierarchy. They are not independent contractors, right? And that has implications for the synergies that the counterfactual can create between the drivers relative to what Uber can create. So we need to think about that counterfactual. And then finally, if we continue to think about what is the composition of the two sides, we can think about, right, I mean, I think in a lot of this work, the assumption is often, well, the two sides would have been the same with or without the platform. But I think we have a lot of reason to think that's often not the case, right? How many people have decided to give up on owning cars because Uber exists? How many people have started driving cars around? Or how many people have opened up, their homes to, guests because of Airbnb that did not exist before, right? So if the platform endogenously changes the nature of the two sides, then we need to think about counterfactuals more broadly. Thinking about counterfactuals is important because, of course, when we talk about what does the platform do and what does it do well, we are implicitly or explicitly comparing it to a specific counterfactual, right? So again, I think Anpu and Rich's paper does a nice job of talking about, what does the platform do? It does search and matching, it does monitoring and certification. Again, in Brian's work, it does monitoring and certification. But again, the question is, what does it do it better than compared to, right? And I think fleshing out what that counterfactual looks like is actually important to being able to make a claim about what the advantage of the counterfactual of the platform is. And then importantly, who does it do it for, right? So this is where sort of Feng's paper about, are we really positioning to a global market or a local market comes in for me. And, Gary Dushnitsky has some, lovely work on crowdfunding, thinking about, how some platforms target like wider audiences, some platforms target narrow audiences. And again, that has implications for, what is this, very classic strategy implications for what is the position we're trying to occupy and what is the sort of unique proposition that we're offering. I think very consistent with David's point about models. And I would argue it's not just searching and matching and monitoring and certification. I think there's, things around training, increasingly we have like A/B testing, et cetera, which allows platforms to actually improve the quality of the offering being provided on the platform, right? Which is not search or matching or certification. It's actually, it's something more than that. And then, once we start to think about what are we competing against and who are we competing against, we can think about what are the different sources of advantage. I'm not going to go through this because I've just been told I have 3 minutes, but I think the point is, network economies are what we end up focusing on because network economies are the relevant capability if the counterfactual is non-platform markets. But as we think about competition between platforms, it's arguable that other things become more relevant, right? Network economies may be necessary, but not sufficient to achieve competitive advantage between platforms. We might need to think about complementary resources like brands. We might need to think about technology and algorithms. Feng mentioned data access, and I think all of that sort of matters. I have no longer seem to be able to move my slides forward, but okay. And then, of course, within that, there's sort of transaction costs, right? I think Claudine did a nice job of sort of talking about some of the challenges of contractability within the firm. But I also think we need to think very carefully about platform opportunism, right? So it's not just opportunism from the agents, which both Brian and Rich and Anpu are talking about. It's also opportunism on the side of the platform, right? And Feng has some really nice work thinking about competing with your complementers. And I have some work thinking about, what does this do to the bargaining power of the platform? And what are the implications of the kind of power we're giving these platforms for the ability of complementers to capture value? And that obviously has implications for what the counterfactual might be. There might be opportunities for us to step in and say, well, I'm going to take less value. This goes back to David's example of NCR. I may be able to create less value, but capture more value if I'm able to bind myself from acting opportunistically. I want to make one final point in the 1 minute I don't have left, which is that you know, this is not the corporate strategy point, but, you know, since I do a lot of work in social impact, I think there's a fascinating set of questions around the social impact of platforms, both on the positive side, right? So how can we, you know, Brian was kind enough to mention some work I have, which thinks about how we can use platforms to solve social problems, to drive innovation in conditions with positive externalities, but also to potentially reset the rules of the game in favor of sites that have been traditionally exploited. At the same time, I think there is a lot of potential for negative social impact, right? So it's not clear to me. I mean, think about Uber again. I think Uber is good for passengers. It's not so clear to me that it's good for drivers. And so to the extent that, and it's not so good for traffic, which means we're creating negative externalities. So I think, you know, aside from all the sort of things that we've talked about, and, you know, Rich and Anpu talk about privacy, and I think there's tremendous opportunities for privacy arbitrage because people don't understand the value of their privacy, so we can give them peanuts and like take away privacy rights that are worth crazy amounts of money. That's a really good strategy for a platform. It's really terrible for society, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done thinking about the social impact aspect as well. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Aseem. Thank you very much. Okay, next up is Todd Zenger. Todd, share your screen if you wish and take it over.
Okay. My thanks as well to the organizers, and I think there'll certainly be some similarities in what I want to say, but also some differences. I think one of the reflections of those that have preceded me as sort of corporate strategy experts, and I would sort of consider myself in that space of an eclectic sort of corporate strategy person. But a lot, you know, sort of the conclusion is that there is a lot that corporate strategy can say about platforms. And I suppose where I'm going to want to end up is a little bit about why I think there's some important insights that we can take from platforms to think more broadly about corporate strategy. And I want to sort of do this a little bit as my personal narrative as I sort of engaged with this research in a way that I had not to this point. I'm not a platform person like all the other panelists, but so it was very intriguing to sort of read this research in a little bit more depth. And so some of this is just sort of thoughts about the platform's research and its implications for corporate strategy. So first, I want to sort of make the point that others have made is that, you know, my initial reaction was, okay, there's absolutely nothing new here. We've been dealing with platforms for a long period of time. You know, we've seen even dominant, oppressive platforms in the past. Actually, we haven't seen them, but our ancestors have seen them. You know, we've seen battles of competing two-sided platforms. We've seen network effects and massive scale economies. You know, we've seen these facilitated by new technology that reduce market friction, fleets of ships. We've seen novel organizational forms. These really were, you know, the early versions of this. Stock companies came out of these massive platforms. And we've seen sort of strategy play a key role. Of course, it wasn't just sort of strategy as we typically think it, but it was a lot of military and political strategy that was involved in these massive platforms. And we also saw a huge hierarchical component to these platforms, right? At its peak, the East India Trading Company had an army of 260,000 people. It was bigger than the British Army to sort of enforce and manage this platform that they were managing. So in essence, platforms are a very, very old phenomenon, but that wasn't sort of where I you know, that wasn't my conclusion from this literature. So one of the things I did was went back to sort of you know, kind of a foundational piece, trying to articulate sort of what a platform is, and this definition by Reisman in the Journal of Economic Perspectives sort of labels platforms as two-sided markets. There's this sort of close connection there in which a two-sided market is one in which two sets of agents interact with an intermediary or platform, and the decisions of each agent the decisions of each set of agents affects the outcomes of the other set of agents, typically through an externality. And then if you look at sort of what's a definition of an intermediary, well, an intermediary is a person who acts as a link between people in order to try to bring about an agreement or reconciliation. It's a mediator. Well, so if that's sort of the definition of what a platform is, then this intermediary's task is to somehow organize, motivate a set of agents into some sort of positive externality in creating complementary platforms or complementary patterns. And a lot of what this research tries to do is to identify the nature of these complementarities in a much more precise way, articulating cross-site network effects and single-site network effects, matching effects, less emphasized in this literature, but certainly emphasized in transactions cost economics, key role of co-specialization, references to supermodularity and just a generic term on complementarity, and even connections obviously to economies of scale. And so I think one of the real contributions of this literature, is that it's providing much greater precision about what complementarities are and what the role of this intermediary or strategic actor is. And so my observation is, look, if that's the definition of what a platform is, well, then every organization is a platform in that sense. It's a multi-sided market, or it's perhaps some hierarchical substitute, or more appropriate substitute trying to manage these multiple sides, that's led by an intermediary, where that intermediary is a strategic actor seeking to compose positive externalities, that is complementarities across sets of agents. And therefore, multi-sided market logic is not sort of a special case, it's not sort of special case strategy logic, but really it's the essence of strategy logic, because all organizations are these multi-sided entities trying to form positive externalities, shaping these complementarities that exist. And as many of our preceding speakers spoke, they often made this comment about, well, this is very, very similar to sort of standard kinds of organizations. Marriott's running a multi-sided market, much of it internally through a hierarchy, and faces these exact same kinds of economic principles and logic as it tries to build these complementarities. The other observation I had in sort of reading this literature is that it obviously has lots of parallels and connections to a wide range of other sort of new strategy literature that has emerged over the last decade. The focus on sort of ecosystems and business models and stakeholders, and even the added value literature really all has this same flavor of a central actor trying to orchestrate a pattern of complements among disparate agents, some of which exist inside the firm and some of which exist outside the firm. And that while they emphasize different pieces, business models more focused on the overarching structure, ecosystems focusing on sort of these external entities, stakeholders focusing on a much more CSR element and particular sets of agents, and the added value literature trying to focus on the underlying economics of cooperation and competition. This same narrative about strategy as being about generating patterns of complementarity is a very, very similar theme. And that's a very different theme, arguably, than what's typically been addressed in strategy, that the dominant theories we've had about competitive positioning and sort of the resource-based view are different in nature. They sort of, relative to this platforms literature, they undersell the role of actors outside the firm, and they fundamentally sort of diminish this creative nature of discovering and assembling complements. You think about sort of the theory of the firm, while it very directly focuses on building and forming complementarities and how one goes about that, there really isn't a central actor that's composing these complementary patterns. It's really providing guidance about, if you tell me the complement you're trying to form, maybe I have some guidance about how to go about doing that. So I think what this approach does is it points to an alternative perspective on really what strategy is in a broader sense. That strategy is about sort of composing, I use the term theories here, but ideas about these patterns of complementarity, theories that illuminate those patterns among sets of agents, and I would include the assets that they control, and then efficiently creating these complementarities through organizational and strategic levers. That's a more kind of coherent view of what strategy is than we've often thought about it. And I think the contribution of this platforms literature and these other related literatures that I referenced is sort of honing in on how we think in a deeper way about what these patterns of complementarity are and how they can be formed and manufactured. So in terms of, kind of the implications for the field, I think we should recognize that a host of new theories and perspectives in strategy, I would argue that many of these, when we sort of think about new ideas in strategy, do all have the same consistent theme, that they're illuminating a similar set of ideas about what strategy is. And recognize, though, at the same time, that this is not new strategy. The issue here is not about the novelty of the phenomenon, although obviously technology is shifting the importance of markets, but hopefully a better articulation of what you might characterize as old strategy, that all organizations are these multi-sided entities seeking to compose complementarity across sets of agents. And that if that's true, if you buy that argument, then we should recognize the commonality across this recent work and focus on developing common rather than divergent language. We're devolving into a whole lot of divergent language, business models, ecosystems, platforms, stakeholders. If it's really all very much similar idea with different focus, can we develop some greater commonality, and in doing so really advance the field?
Okay, thanks very much, Todd. Are you up to do more?
No, well, I'll just say this point and then I'll be done. I think we also we need to evaluate the sufficiency of existing theory in guiding how to organizationally construct these complementarities. Do we have currently the right theoretical toolkit to do that? Is the theory of the firm that we already have enough, or do we need an alternative, kind of approach to that theory or embellishment of that theory to really think about, now that we've got this more expansive view of what complementarities are and how to form them, do we need a different toolkit about how to organizationally construct those? All right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Todd. So next up is Ron Adner. Ron, do you have control of the screen, I think, right?
I have control of myself and all of us. I don't need control of a screen.
I'm
And
just
so,
to make sure he's a co-host.
no, I don't have a presentation for us. I have a bunch of notes that I want to talk through.
Oh, okay. Shut up.
So look, this, first of all, thanks for organizing this, and beyond organizing it, thanks for a great opportunity to think, both to think through stuff, but also to hear other thoughtful people think through stuff. I think this was really, for me, this was fascinating. I've spent the last year on sabbatical working on a book that, and kind of, this has been very helpful for me to see some new connections. I'll work backwards, which is, if you ask me what's new about what we're talking about, I'm totally with Todd. There's nothing fundamentally new in the world for strategy, et cetera, except that things that we've been able to get away being vague about are harder and harder to justify. So Todd is right. Look, the heart of strategy is value creation. Okay, in the last, 15, 20 years, we've had this whole kind of value-based approach to strategy. Paying attention to complementers, call it whatever you want, an ecosystem, a platform, a business model, et cetera. We are much more sensitive to the fact that value creation happens in an interdependent way, whether that happens within the boundaries of the firm or across firms. And I think part of what we're wrestling with is the fact that, we have this thing called value-based strategy, and then we feel good, and yet we criticize the economists for talking about widgets, right? We make fun of microeconomics for not having an understanding for their context. So supply and demand, there's a widget factory. If you think about the way we talk about value, it is at an incredibly high level of abstraction. So we can talk about these phenomenons of interdependence, network effects, et cetera. But I think part of what I've been wrestling with is what if we took the notion of value more seriously? We have so much theory to talk about the supply side. Okay, I've been kind of pushing demand side for a long time, but even in my work on the demand side, there's this notion of the customer wants something. And yet I think part of what we're seeing throughout the presentations and discussions is the fact that, I think David was talking about, we can think about these as strategic groups. In some ways, the reason we were able to get away by talking about whether it was industries or strategic groups was because the actors working in the space looked sufficiently close together that we could talk about them as the auto industry or the luxury segment of the auto industry, because BMW and Daimler look close enough. And yet I think part of what's we've been confronting at every level, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the real world, whether it's in our research, is the fact that, so Uber has kind of changed the game. Now we talk about a mobility ecosystem. And if you're at Ford, you're totally confused. And the question is, what are the strategy tools that we have today to deal with this reconfiguration of value? And, again, I think the idea, we've had platforms for 1,000 years. We have an ecosystem since the start of civilization. Okay, so in this book, I talk about the Romans building road networks and figuring out how to govern at a distance. The big difference is that today, as David said, MBA students are talking about building these. It's not the British East India Company that needs to figure out, can I get permission from the Crown? It's that facilitated by technology, et cetera, access to capital, globalization, we're seeing so much more variation, moving so much more quickly that it's getting harder to justify not being able to speak to it. So I think for me, I'll put a couple of points out there, and to the extent that people are interested to the way I've thought about it. I think there's tremendous work being done on platforms. I think there's massively open opportunity to think about how platforms are actually constructed. For those interested, I think, so in my previous book, Wide Lens, I spent a lot of time talking towards the end of the book about how these complementers are actually brought into place and aligned. So we can think about how Apple moves from making MP3 players to entering the phone market to then, with some delay, having aligned those actors, move through a staged expansion process to open up the platform to developers, to then start charging them an arm and a leg with 30%, not on their apps, but in the in-app payments. We can think about that. And I think if we think about those things more in a structured way, we can get some traction, not just about how platforms work, but how do you get to the point of having built that platform? I think part of what we're seeing is there's a lot of variation in what it is these platforms are actually doing, right? So we have some things that are very close to one another. Lyft and Uber look pretty close, although Uber's scope strategy is obviously far, far broader. On the other hand, you know, there was a time and place when people thought that eBay and Amazon were going to start looking more and more alike, right? And we've seen massive divergence there. You know, you could look across, look at what's happening in China. You know, we thought Alibaba was like Amazon. Boy, Alibaba and Amazon, they look very, very different today. And we need to get into the details of that construction. And for me, again, so kind of another self-reference. So this article in Journal of Management, which is now open access, ecosystem as structure, kind of what I would encourage people to think about is it's not just the composition of the platform. It's not just what are the sides. And it's not even just how they're brought together. It's how are the pieces in the middle aligned? Okay, how is the value process that, I love Todd's presentation. Yeah, so how do we line up these complementars? Because the platform is the end. It's not the beginning, right? Every company that you can think of as starting a platform, unless you're something I'm talking about really simple, like a singles bar, and even then you need to figure out how to attract people, right? We're building elements of value. And so for me, that's really the open territory. So as I said, so kind of the last, so I guess my sabbatical is over. So the last 13 months, kind of a big occupation for me has been kind of working on this new book, which will come out next summer, thinking about what is a language that we can develop to talk about value in a structured way, something that lives between the notion of activities and the notion of the value proposition. And then once we have that, how can we talk about these things that no longer look like clean industries, right? And I think that's really part of the tensions. We're using, whether you want to use the word ecosystem or you want to use platform, we're kind of using these as proxies for talking about entities coordinating and creating values in ways that are less consistent with the old Porterian view for us to be able to talk about competition, right? So that I think is another big opportunity. How do we think about really competing in value space so we can put some specificity on ideas around differentiation, right? Differentiated versus low cost is an easy contrast. Just look at the price. Differentiated versus differentiated, that's, you know, we need something better than Lancasterian space to just talk about distance in a line. So anyway, that's what, that's kind of the thinking this was, that the session spurred. And again, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here and just be stimulated in this way.
Thanks very much, Ron. So we are running a bit behind schedule. I do want to try to leave at least half an hour for the breakout sessions. So I would say we have time for maybe one question for the panelists. So if anybody's got a particularly good zinger of a question, just feel free to speak up.
Perhaps a comment, if I might. Presentations are so great, they leave us speechless. They give us opportunity to think about many, many questions. And thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Thanks, Hugh. Can I just say, this is not a question, but I just want to say on behalf of STR, I just want to thank, because I know we're going to go to the breakout rooms and many of you are going to drop off. I want to first thank, I want to thank Rich and Anpu and all the organizers. I mean, we just gave you the option of doing this virtual PDW. It's amazing that you've put together such a wonderful panel. I mean, of course, there's some, dark spots, like including me, but, aside from those minor mistakes, I think it's a great panel and it's been wonderful. And I want to thank all, I know we're sort of dwindling, but, the hundreds of people who signed up and participated for being here.